The hospital was always busy, full of people rushing from one place to another. Machines beeped, phones rang, and the sound of hurried footsteps filled the air. St. Adelaide Medical Center was a big, important hospital in the city. People came here when they needed the best care, and doctors and nurses worked hard to keep everything running. Among all this activity was Dr. Marcus Hale. He walked through the halls quickly, his white coat swinging behind him. He looked serious, almost angry as he gave orders to everyone he passed. Dr. Hale was known as one of the best doctors in the hospital. He was smart and skilled, and many patients trusted him with their lives. But the nurses and other staff felt differently. To them he was rude and arrogant, always talking down to them. Dr. Hale believed he was the most important person in the hospital. He thought nurses and junior doctors were there only to follow his orders. He never thanked anyone or asked politely. To him, being in charge meant giving orders, not working with others. Today was no different. He snapped at a nurse who didn't hand him a chart fast enough. "Why is everything so slow today?" he muttered as he walked away without waiting for a response. Meanwhile, Tiana Brooks stood quietly at the nurse's station. She wore simple blue scrubs like all the other nurses. Her hair was tied back neatly and her expression was calm. She worked quickly, sorting through patient charts and making sure everything was in the right place. Tiana didn't stand out at first glance, but there was something about her. She moved with quiet confidence, and people noticed how steady and focused she was, even when the hospital was at its busiest. What most people didn't know was that Tiana wasn't just another nurse. She was the medical director of St. Adelaide Medical Center. She was the one in charge of running the hospital, making big decisions, and ensuring everything worked smoothly. Today she was helping on the floor because the team was short-staffed. This wasn't unusual for her. Tiana believed that good leaders should understand the work of everyone in the hospital, from doctors to nurses to the cleaning staff. To her, no job was too small or unimportant. Tiana's journey to becoming the medical director had been anything but easy. She had grown up in a poor neighborhood where life was tough and opportunities were few. Her parents worked long hours to support the family. Her father was a factory worker, and her mother worked in a school cafeteria. They didn't have much money, but they always encouraged Tiana to work hard and dream big. As a child, Tiana loved learning. One day, her mother brought home a set of old encyclopedias from a garage sale. The books were worn, but Tiana didn't care. She spent hours flipping through the pages, fascinated by the pictures and information about the human body. She dreamed of becoming a doctor one day, even though it seemed impossible. When she got to high school, a visiting doctor gave a talk in her science class. He spoke about his career and how he had worked hard to get there. "You can do anything you set your mind to," he said. Those words stuck with Tiana. She decided then and there that she would become a doctor, no matter how hard it was. Tiana's path started with nursing. She worked at a small hospital while taking college classes at night. Her days were long and exhausting. She would wake up early, work a full shift, then go to class, often studying late into the night. It wasn't easy, but Tiana was determined. She saved every dollar she could to pay for medical school. When she finally got into medical school, Tiana faced a new set of challenges. She was often the only black woman in her classes, and some people doubted she belonged there. Professors and classmates sometimes made comments that made her feel out of place. But Tiana didn't let their doubts stop her. She studied harder than anyone else and graduated with honors. Even after becoming a doctor, Tiana didn't immediately move into a leadership role. She decided to go back to working as a nurse for a while, even though she had a medical degree. She wanted to better understand the challenges nurses faced every day. She believed that experiencing the job firsthand would make her a better doctor and leader. Some people thought this decision was strange, but Tiana knew it was the right thing to do. Over the years, Tiana climbed the ranks in the medical field. Her hard work and dedication didn't go unnoticed. She earned respect from her peers and eventually became the medical director of St. Adelaide Medical Center. Despite her high position, she stayed humble. Tiana believed leadership was about serving others, not showing off your title. Back in the present, Tiana continued her work on the floor, helping wherever she was needed. She adjusted an IV for a patient in one room, then checked on supplies in another. Nurses whispered quietly as they watched her. "Can you believe she's the medical director?" one of them said. "She's amazing," another replied. Most people in her position wouldn't bother helping on the floor. Tiana heard them but didn't react. She was used to this kind of surprise. Most leaders in the hospital rarely left their offices, but Tiana believed it was important to be hands-on. As Tiana finished checking a chart, she heard a loud voice from the other side of the room. "Where is everyone?" Dr. Hale demanded, his tone sharp and impatient. Why does it take so long to get a simple chart ready? Tiana turned to see Dr. Hale walking toward her. His eyes locked on her and he frowned. You, he said, pointing at her. I need the chart for Mr. Thompson now. Without hesitation, Tiana handed him the chart she had already prepared. Here it is, Dr. Hale, she said, her voice calm. Dr. Hale grabbed the chart without looking at her. Finally, he muttered, flipping through the pages. He didn't thank her or even glance in her direction before walking away. Tiana stood there for a moment, then returned to her work. To her, this was just another day in the hospital. She was used to being overlooked by people like Dr. Hale, who assumed they were the only ones who mattered. She didn't let it bother her. Tiana knew her worth and the importance of her role, even if others didn't see it right away. As she continued her tasks, Tiana thought back to how far she had come. From a young girl with a dream to the medical director of one of the city's top hospitals, her journey had been long and difficult. But she wouldn't change a thing. Every struggle, every challenge had shaped her into the person she was today. The day wasn't over, and Tiana knew there would be more moments like this. But she was ready. What Dr. Hale didn't know was that the nurse he had dismissed so easily was the one running the hospital he thought he ruled. The ward was alive with the hum of activity as nurses moved briskly between patients, adjusting IVs, checking monitors, and scribbling notes on charts. Tiana stood near the nurse's station, flipping through a stack of patient files. Her focus was steady, her hands moving efficiently as she ensured every detail was accurate. Around her, the hospital's rhythm pulsed, organized chaos that Tiana had learned to navigate with calm precision. The sound of quick, heavy footsteps broke through the noise, followed by the sharp voice of Dr. Marcus Hale. What is going on here? He demanded as he entered the ward, his presence instantly commanding attention. His eyes swept the room, taking in the staff, though not with interest or concern. To him, they were merely tools to get the job done. Without waiting for a response, he began barking orders. We're already behind schedule and I don't have time for delays. Where is the file for Mr. Connolly? And why hasn't room 312 been prepped yet? His words came out in rapid succession, leaving no room for anyone to respond. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances, their movements quickening under his scrutinizing gaze. Dr. Hale's voice carried the weight of authority, but his tone held no trace of respect. He rarely bothered with greetings or pleasantries. Efficiency was all that mattered to him. His eyes landed on Tiana, who was focused on the chart in her hands, double-checking medication dosages for a patient. She didn't look up immediately, which seemed to irritate him. You there? He called out sharply, pointing at her. What are you doing standing around? Do you not realize how behind we are? I need you to move faster. Bring me the chart for Mr. Thompson now. Tiana glanced up, her expression neutral but her gaze steady. I'm reviewing a patient's medication, Dr. Hale, she said calmly, her voice measured. I've already prepared Mr. Thompson's chart. It's right here. She handed it to him without hesitation, her movements deliberate and professional. Dr. Hale snatched the chart from her hand, barely glancing at her. Finally, he muttered, flipping through the pages. This is why things take so long around here, he added under his breath, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. Tiana returned to her work, unfazed by his tone. But Dr. Hale wasn't finished. He closed the chart with a snap and turned back to her. Do you even understand how urgent this is? He asked, his voice rising. Patients' lives are on the line and you're just standing there wasting time. I need people who can keep up with the pace of this hospital, not slow us down. The room grew quiet as his words hung in the air. Nurses paused in their tasks, their eyes darting between Dr. Hale and Tiana. A few junior doctors nearby froze, unsure whether to intervene or keep their heads down. Tiana met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. I understand the urgency, Dr. Hale, she replied evenly. I assure you, everything is under control. The patient files are updated, and the medications are verified. Her steady response only seemed to fuel his frustration. Control? He repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. If this is your idea of control, I'd hate to see what chaos looks like. People like you need to prove you can handle the pressure here. This isn't some second-rate clinic. Tiana felt the sting of his words, not because they were true, but because of the assumptions behind them. She could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at her, as if she didn't belong. His words carried an unspoken message, subtle but undeniable. She held his gaze, refusing to let his tone shake her. I've handled situations like this before, Dr. Hale, she said, her voice unwavering. The patients are my priority, and I'm ensuring they receive the best care possible. Her calm demeanor seemed to frustrate him further. He waved a dismissive hand and turned away. "Just make sure everything is done properly," he said, his voice still sharp. "I don't have time to fix mistakes." He stormed off, leaving a trail of tension in his wake. The room remained quiet for a moment, the staff exchanging uncomfortable glances. No one said anything, but their unease was palpable. Tiana stood there for a moment, her hands still holding the chart she had been reviewing. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the silent judgment of those who had witnessed the interaction. But she refused to let her composure falter. She took a deep breath, grounding herself, and returned to her work. The awkward silence lingered for a few more seconds before the staff slowly resumed their tasks. The nurses moved a little more cautiously now, their shoulders tense, as if trying to avoid becoming the next target of Dr. Hale's ire. Tiana didn't blame them for their silence. She knew the power dynamics at play in the hospital, the unspoken rules that kept people in their lanes. Speaking up against someone like Dr. Hale wasn't easy, especially for those lower on the hierarchy. Still, the encounter weighed on her. It wasn't the first time she had been dismissed or underestimated, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But Tiana wasn't the type to let moments like this consume her. She had learned long ago to pick her battles, to stay focused on the bigger picture. As she continued her work, she couldn't help but wonder if Dr. Hale would ever realize who he had just berated. But even if he didn't, Tiana knew her worth. Titles and positions didn't define her. Her actions did. And today, just like every day, she would let those actions speak for themselves. The ward returned to its usual rhythm, but the tension from Dr. Hale's outburst lingered in the air like a heavy cloud. Nurses moved cautiously, their footsteps quieter than before, their conversations hushed. Yet, whispers began to spread as soon as Dr. Hale was out of earshot. "Did you see how he spoke to her?" one nurse asked in a low voice, glancing toward Tiana, who was calmly reviewing a chart as if nothing had happened. "Yeah," another nurse replied, shaking her head. "I can't believe he had the nerve. She handled it so well, though. I would have lost it." Nearby, a group of junior doctors gathered near the nurse's station, exchanging puzzled looks. "That was harsh, even for Dr. Hale," one of them muttered. "He acts like nurses are just there to serve him." Amid the quiet murmurs, one voice cut through with certainty. A senior nurse, someone who had worked at the hospital for over a decade, leaned in toward the group with a knowing look. "Do you even know who she is?" she asked, her tone carrying weight. The younger nurses and doctors exchanged confused glances. "What do you mean?" one of them asked hesitantly. "She's not just a nurse," the senior nurse said, lowering her voice slightly as if revealing a secret. "That's Dr. Tiana Brooks. She's the medical director of this entire hospital." A stunned silence followed. Eyes widened, jaws dropped, and everyone leaned in closer as if they couldn't trust their ears. "Wait, what?" a young nurse whispered. "You're kidding, right?" The senior nurse shook her head. "No joke. She's been the medical director for years. She's one of the best leaders this hospital has ever had. And she just stood there and let him talk to her like that." The weight of the revelation spread quickly through the ward. Staff who had witnessed the confrontation replayed the scene in their minds, their shock deepening as they realized the significance of what they had seen. They whispered among themselves, their voices carrying a mixture of disbelief and newfound respect for Tiana. Meanwhile, Dr. Hale was sitting in the break room, his usual air of superiority intact. Across from him sat a junior doctor, nervously stirring his coffee and nodding along to Dr. Hale's monologue. "Sometimes you just have to lay down the law," Dr. Hale said, leaning back in his chair. "That nurse was slowing everything down. Can you believe it? Standing there, wasting time while patients are waiting. I had to put her in her place." The junior doctor stiffened, his hand pausing mid-stir. He knew exactly who Dr. Hale was talking about. The so-called lazy nurse was none other than Dr. Tiana Brooks, the medical director. The thought made his stomach twist with discomfort. Yeah, the junior doctor said hesitantly, unsure how to respond. He didn't want to challenge Dr. Hale directly, knowing how the senior doctor's temper flared. But he also felt uneasy letting the conversation continue unchecked. Dr. Hale misinterpreted the hesitation as agreement. He smirked and continued, "I mean, honestly, some people just aren't cut out for this level of work. You'd think they'd know better than to stand around doing nothing." The junior doctor managed a weak nod, his mind racing. Should he say something? Should he correct Dr. Hale? He glanced down at his coffee, deciding against it. He didn't want to get on Dr. Hale's bad side, especially as someone still trying to establish his place in the hospital. Word spread like wildfire. By the time Dr. Hale returned to his office, the entire ward was buzzing with the news. People whispered in hallways, shared knowing looks, and recounted the story to anyone who hadn't yet heard. It didn't take long for the information to reach Dr. Hale. A passing comment from a nurse stopped him in his tracks. "You know," she said, her voice casual but pointed, "Dr. Brooks is probably the most patient medical director I've ever met. Most people in her position wouldn't have handled that so gracefully." Dr. Hale froze. "Dr. Brooks?" he repeated, his tone sharp. "What does she have to do with this?" The nurse gave him a confused look. "The nurse you were speaking to earlier," she said slowly as if he should already know. "That was Dr. Tiana Brooks, the medical director." The words hit Dr. Hale like a freight train. He stared at the nurse, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. "No," he said, shaking his head slightly. "That can't be. She was wearing scrubs." The nurse raised an eyebrow. "She wears scrubs all the time when she's helping on the floor. She believes in being hands-on with the staff." With that, the nurse walked away, leaving Dr. Hale standing there, stunned. The realization settled in slowly, each piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The calm composure, the precise efficiency, the lack of fluster despite his berating tone, it all made sense now. She wasn't just some nurse he could bark orders at. She was the one who oversaw the entire hospital, the one who held more authority than anyone else in the building. Dr. Hale's face flushed with embarrassment as the gravity of his actions hit him. He had not only disrespected a colleague, but he had humiliated the very person who ran the hospital he thought he controlled. Worse, he had done it in front of other staff, cementing his arrogance and ignorance for everyone to see. He replayed the incident in his mind, cringing at his own words. "People like you need to prove you can handle the pressure here." The statement echoed in his head, now laden with a weight he hadn't felt before. It wasn't just condescending, it was insulting, loaded with assumptions about her competence and worth. Dr. Hale sat down at his desk, his usual confidence evaporating. For the first time in years he felt small, unsure of himself. He realized that the pride he had taken in his position, the authority he thought he wielded so effortlessly, had blinded him to the reality of his actions. The room seemed quieter now, the hum of the hospital distant and muted. Dr. Hale leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had made a mistake, a big one, and he knew there would be consequences. But for now, all he could feel was the sting of his own arrogance and the looming weight of what was to come. The boardroom was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Senior hospital administrators sat around the long conference table, their faces serious, their hands fidgeting with pens or papers as they waited for the meeting to begin. Tiana entered the room calmly, her posture upright, her expression poised. She carried no visible sign of the incident from earlier that week, but everyone in the room knew why they were gathered. Her quiet strength commanded the room without a word. Dr. Hale arrived moments later, his usual confidence noticeably subdued. He took a seat across from Tiana, avoiding eye contact. His mind raced, replaying the events of the ward, and the whispers that had spread through the hospital. The realization of who Tiana was had shaken him to his core, and now, faced with the leadership team, he felt the weight of accountability pressing down on him. Mr. Thompson, the head of hospital management, cleared his throat to start the meeting. "Thank you all for being here. Today's meeting is focused on addressing workplace culture and ensuring respect among all levels of staff. Recently, we've had reports of incidents that raise concerns about how we communicate and treat one another." His words were measured, but his eyes darted briefly to Dr. Hale, making it clear this was more than a general discussion. Tiana sat quietly, allowing Mr. Thompson to continue. She had no intention of starting this conversation with accusations. This was about more than one incident, it was about the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to persist. "Dr. Brooks," Mr. Thompson said, turning to her, "as our medical director, would you like to share your thoughts on the matter?" Tiana nodded, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I believe it's important to address the culture of respect within our hospital. We work in a high-pressure environment where mistakes can cost lives. But that pressure cannot excuse a lack of professionalism or basic human decency. How we treat one another impacts not only our morale but also the quality of care we provide to our patients." She paused, scanning the room. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "We must recognize that respect is not optional. It is essential. It must flow in all directions, regardless of position, title, or background." Dr. Hale shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He knew this was about him even if Tiana hadn't said his name. The pointed nature of her words left little doubt. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath and looked directly at Dr. Hale. Dr. Hale, we've received reports about a recent interaction on the ward that seems to exemplify the very issues Dr. Brooks is addressing. Can you explain what happened? Dr. Hale felt all eyes turn to him, the weight of their expectations pressing down. He hesitated, his usual sharp tongue suddenly dulled by the enormity of the moment. He began, struggling to find his words. There was a misunderstanding on the ward earlier this week. I was under a lot of pressure, and I may have spoken more harshly than I intended. Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow, clearly unsatisfied with the vague response. Dr. Hale, this isn't just about tone. This is about respect. Please elaborate. Dr. Hale swallowed hard, glancing briefly at Tiana, who sat across from him, her face unreadable. I spoke to a nurse in a manner that was inappropriate, he admitted, his voice quieter now. I assumed things that I shouldn't have. I didn't recognize her position and I acted poorly. Tiana watched him closely but remained silent. This wasn't the moment for her to intervene. Dr. Hale needed to acknowledge his actions fully. And do you understand why this incident is being brought to our attention? Mr. Thompson pressed. Dr. Hale nodded slowly. Yes. I disrespected a colleague and made assumptions that were unfair and biased. My behavior was unprofessional and unacceptable. The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Finally, Tiana spoke, her tone measured and deliberate. Dr. Hale, I appreciate your acknowledgement of the situation. But this isn't just about one interaction or one person. This is about a culture that allows such interactions to happen. It's about addressing the unspoken hierarchies and biases that permeate our workplace. Dr. Hale looked down at his hands, his usual confidence completely replaced by humility. You're right, he said softly. I've been blind to how my actions affect others. I've been so focused on outcomes that I've forgotten the importance of how we get there. For that, I'm sorry. He finally looked up at Tiana, his eyes meeting hers. I'm sorry, Dr. Brooks, for the way I treated you. I disrespected you and made assumptions I had no right to make. I'll do better. Tiana nodded, her expression softening slightly. Thank you, Dr. Hale. I accept your apology. But remember, this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring no one else has to experience what I did. That's the change we need to work toward. Mr. Thompson spoke up, addressing the room as a whole. This incident serves as a wake-up call for all of us. Effective immediately, we'll be implementing mandatory training on workplace respect and bias awareness. We'll also be reviewing our policies to ensure a culture of inclusivity and mutual respect across all levels of staff. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs of agreement. Dr. Hale remained silent, but there was a sense of resolve in his posture now. He knew he had a long way to go to rebuild trust, not just with Tiana but with the entire hospital staff. As the meeting concluded, Tiana stood, her calm composure never faltering. She had accomplished what she came to do, not to humiliate Dr. Hale, but to address the broader issue and set the stage for meaningful change. Dr. Hale approached her as the others began to file out. Dr. Brooks, he said hesitantly, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. I really am sorry. And thank you for handling this with grace. Tiana looked at him, her expression thoughtful. It's not about grace, Dr. Hale, she said. It's about responsibility. We all have a responsibility to make this hospital a place where everyone feels valued. Let's make sure we don't forget that. Dr. Hale nodded, his gratitude evident. Tiana turned and walked out of the room, her steps steady, her head held high. The work was far from over, but this was a step in the right direction. The changes began almost immediately after the meeting. Word spread quickly through the hospital. Diversity and inclusion training was no longer optional but mandatory for all staff, from the highest-ranking surgeons to the custodial team. The sessions were comprehensive, addressing not only workplace respect but also unconscious bias, power dynamics, and the importance of fostering a supportive environment. Tiana played a key role in shaping the curriculum. She worked closely with HR and external consultants to ensure the training went beyond surface-level lessons. For her, this wasn't just a procedural update, it was a chance to create real change. The staff approached the sessions with mixed reactions. Some welcomed the opportunity for growth, while others, like Dr. Hale, attended reluctantly at first. Sitting in a training room surrounded by colleagues, Dr. Hale found himself in unfamiliar territory. The sessions asked him to confront uncomfortable truths about his behavior and the assumptions he had carried for years. Initially, he resisted, finding excuses to dismiss what was being taught. But as the days passed and he listened to stories from his colleagues, particularly from nurses and minority staff, he began to see the broader picture. Dr. Hale started to notice patterns in his behavior. He reflected on how he had dismissed nurses' contributions, assumed authority without collaboration, and most recently humiliated someone who had far more responsibility than he'd cared to understand. These realizations weren't easy for him, but they were necessary. Slowly, the training sessions became less of a chore and more of a wake-up call. For the first time in his career, he recognized that being a good doctor wasn't just about medical skill, it was about being a good colleague and leader. He began making small but significant changes. He started thanking nurses and support staff, asking for their input during rounds, and encouraging open dialogue. His transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't perfect, but the effort was visible. Dr. Hale also took on a new role as a mentor to junior doctors, teaching them not only about medicine but also about the importance of respect and teamwork. He often shared his own experiences, including his mistakes, as cautionary tales. Meanwhile, Tiana's influence grew beyond the hospital walls. Staff admired her even more after the incident, not just for her position but for the way she had handled herself, with grace, dignity, and a focus on the bigger picture. Nurses often shared stories about how Tiana's hands-on leadership made them feel valued. Junior doctors spoke of her as a role model, someone who balanced authority with empathy. It wasn't long before word of Tiana's leadership reached other institutions. Invitations poured in for her to speak at conferences, panels, and seminars. She accepted many of them, using her platform to share her story. At these events, Tiana didn't just talk about the confrontation with Dr. Hale. Instead, she framed it as an example of the larger systemic issues that exist in many workplaces. She emphasized the importance of addressing biases, creating inclusive cultures, and holding people accountable, not to punish but to improve. One of her most memorable speeches was at a national medical leadership conference, where she recounted her journey from nurse to medical director. She spoke about the challenges of being underestimated, the lessons she had learned, and the changes she hoped to inspire. Her words resonated with the audience, many of whom left the session with a renewed sense of purpose. Back at St. Adelaide, the changes began to take root. Staff morale improved as employees felt more respected and valued. The hospital's leadership committed to ongoing training and policy reviews, ensuring that the culture continued to evolve. Tiana remained at the forefront of these efforts, quietly but effectively steering the institution toward a better future. In her personal life, Tiana found moments of peace and reflection. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, she sat with her family in their cozy living room. Her husband was reading a book, her 2 children were laughing over a board game, and the soft hum of life filled the space. Tiana leaned back on the couch, her mind drifting to the incident with Dr. Hale. What had begun as a moment of personal humiliation had become a catalyst for systemic change, not just for her hospital but for herself. She felt a deep sense of pride, not in her title or accomplishments, but in the impact she had made. She thought of her younger self, the girl who had pored over a second-hand encyclopedia, dreaming of a future that had often seemed out of reach. That girl could never have imagined this, a life where she not only overcame the odds but also helped others do the same. As she watched her children, she smiled, knowing that her work wasn't just for her but for them and for the generations that would follow. She had faced bias, arrogance, and systemic barriers, but she had stood firm, using resilience and humility as her tools. And in doing so, she had changed the narrative, not just for herself but for everyone around her. The video closes with Tiana walking through the hospital, her steps steady, her head held high. Staff greet her warmly, their respect evident. In the background, her voice narrates a final message. True leadership isn't about titles or authority. It's about lifting others, creating spaces where everyone feels valued, and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Change doesn't happen overnight, but with commitment and courage, it's always possible. The screen fades to black, leaving viewers with a powerful message. Resilience, humility, and the courage to confront bias can spark transformation, both within ourselves and in the world around us.